All right, this is Jeremy Rothkushel.
And this is Greg McCarran.
And we are doing a new format here. Doing a live recording on Clubhouse in a room that we've set up titled Seeds of Fire, Israel and China, Microsoft. And this is part of a new club that we've set up on Clubhouse that, because of character limitations, we've titled Antedote, Deepcore Texts. And if we had a little bit more, a few more characters, I think maybe we would have included Antedote Political Deepcore or Deepcore Politics. Because what we mean by the phrase of Deepcore is combining deep politics with core political speech. And so it's an area where we feel that we have something to contribute to the public discourse in the realm of deep politics. But sometimes deep politics can tend towards areas where people get caught in echo chambers, vacuums, areas that don't actually potentially impact our political moment, which is the reason that we then want to do core politics. And core politics, I believe, is defined like core political speech in a First Amendment context in the United States is defined as speech that is political, that is intended towards political change, actually. And so that's what we mean by Antedote Deepcore. And this club is specifically about a bunch of texts that we are both aware of and have begun to read through. And the point of this club is for us to roll out reading from segments of all of these different, we believe, core political documents that help us understand what's going on right now, and then where we might go.
Yes, and so we're just over time here via this Clubhouse, and also obviously playing this as well onto our other streams, platforms like YouTube, Patreon, etc. We're going to be just, I think quite frequently here, I like to think as often as we can, we'll be getting into some of these various long-form books as well as texts of policy papers, etc. And just for us, I think this is the way to like to expand our output, get more out there on the record, and put out some very, very serious, as you said, deep core, this intersection between deep politics and core important matters that are like, I believe, that are important in terms of like a bigger understanding of domestic politics, geopolitics, etc. And so we're going to start here with going through a couple of, I believe, key pieces of literature that really get into this relationship that I think is very important to understand in the current moment of our of world events, of the way of geopolitical trends, this aspect of China. China and particularly its relationship with Israel, and how it does relate to some very important matters on things relating from American national security to the balance of global geopolitics. So anyway, this just over time though, we're definitely got the goal of getting into a lot of interesting text and perhaps increasing our own understanding as well as our audiences of these of a variety of different matters. So we're going to get started here with getting into this aspect of China and Israel based on particularly on the book Seeds of Fire. So
yes, and before we play our intro music and start the reading, and we're going to go for about maybe around 2 hours, up to around 2 hours, reading selections from Seeds of Fire, China and the Story Behind the Attack on America by Gordon Thomas. And then the second book will be Israel and China, From Silk Road to Innovation Highway by Lionel Friedfeld and Philippe Metudi, Understanding Asia's Relationship with the Jewish State. And at this very moment, there's actually another room on Clubhouse that is specifically cybersecurity professionals talking about the current news story. Actually, that's the epicenter of it, which has to do with what Wired titled Chinese hacking spree hit in, quote, astronomical number of victims. A single group appears to have infiltrated tens of thousands of Microsoft Exchange servers in an ongoing onslaught. And so what we seek to do here is add some geopolitical context and flush out the deep political truths that are often not known or not talked about, while also then fleshing out the larger arc of strategy that might be represented behind these headlines around Microsoft and China and some of the key missing things. And then one last thing, I guess, being that it's International Women's Day, I think, is that playing in the background here will be the question of the Epstein-Maxwell operation. And I just want to point out and acknowledge that that would have been totally gone from public discourse if it hadn't been for women, a whole group of women, from all of the victims who refused to let it go when they were totally, they were purposefully discredited, attacked, ignored, suppressed by all kinds of institutions, press, justice, FBI, and then of course journalists who pushed it forward too. And so I just want to acknowledge that, and that plays immediately in the contextual background in relationship most obviously to Microsoft and Israel. And we may end up playing a clip from the radio show Understanding Israel Palestine Beyond the Walls that I produced for 90.1 FM KKFI Kansas City Community Radio, where I interviewed Whitney Webb about the background of Epstein and specifically Ghislaine Maxwell and her sisters, the twin sisters, in relationship to both Silicon Valley and specifically Microsoft, and the founders of Microsoft. And that part of the story, the ongoing story, relates directly to Microsoft Israel. And so this is some of the context that we want to supply in relationship to this this headline around this Microsoft quote-unquote hack that is being ascribed to a Chinese persistent threat group.
Yes, indeed, I concur with all of that, and certainly as we dig into this, as you'll see, like we just mentioned, the Epstein-Maxwell operation, and I definitely second your thoughts regarding all of the brave women out there who have kept this story alive for years now. Some people have been on longer than others, but I mean, just in general, you wouldn't have this without these nonstop attempts over the years to continue to keep this Epstein story alive by and large by women. So I definitely concur with everything you said there. But as you even just mentioning the Maxwell Epstein aspect of this, I mean, it shows you that like the stakes and the ramifications of like this bigger China-Israel relationship and how it figures into, like, as we said, the bigger geopolitical picture on a number of matters relating from the geopolitical balance of power to national security to these very elite, high-level compromise operations that may keep politicians and people in positions of certain positions of influence and power continually beholden to these interests that are that result in a lot of very bad negative policies, both domestically and globally. I mean, there's so many reasons why this deeper history is so important to understand. And, we're just learning along with everybody else as we go along here. But definitely this, we might call it hidden history to a large extent. I mean, it's out there for anybody to find out, but it's been very largely concealed. There hasn't been a ton of attention and emphasis placed on some of the aspects, particularly that are going to be talked about within the book Seeds of Fire. So, I mean, there's a lot of ramifications to these to these dynamics in a number of different areas. So,
all right. Okay. Antedote, Deepcore, text, Seeds of Fire, Israel and China, Microsoft.
We must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
Huh? What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No collusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
All right, we're back. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth-Gushel.
All right, so now we are going to get into selected aspects of the book Seeds of Fire. Can you give the full title? I'm sorry.
The full title is Seeds of Fire: China and the Story Behind the Attack on America by Gordon Thomas.
Thank you.
Sure. And here we are, coming from the radical heart of America and the radical middle of America.
Indeed, for a number of reasons. Yeah, for reasons we'll get into another time. Missouri is going to become a very interesting battleground if some of these political dynamics are going to come to fruition. But we'll talk about that another time.
All right, we're going to start basically the very beginning of this book. We're going to start from chapter 1, the first page of writing on the book, Seeds of Fire, China and the Story Behind the Attack on America by Gordon Thomas, titled The Third Millennium. Quote, December 2000, Washington, D.C. George John Tenet, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency on that cold winter's morning in December 2000, had told friends that among the many things he would miss when he came to relinquish office was the privilege of being chauffeur-driven from his headquarters in Langley's 219 acres of pleasant and partially wooded Virginian countryside along the banks of the Potomac River. For the past year and a half, he had held the office of America's chief official spy master. Tenet had enjoyed many other small privileges that went with the job. The elevator that only he could ride up to his private office, his private dining room, the right to choose the wall color which complemented the neutral carpet in his office suite, and of course the vast expanse of desk behind which so many of his illustrious predecessors had once sat to secretly rule over their world. William Joseph Casey, Stansfield Turner, William Egan Colby, James Rodney Schlesinger, Richard Helms, all the way back to the legendary and probably the greatest of them all, Alan Welsh Dulles. In between had come George Herbert Walker Bush for less than a year, 30th of January 1976 to 20th of January 1977. Now he held an even more important position, the father of the present president of the United States. Officially, he had no part to play in the new administration, but everyone tutored in the ways of Washington knew his son would not make a single important move without consulting his father. Most important of all, the former president would set the agenda for the administration's foreign policy. The first evidence of what that would be could come with the younger Bush's attitude towards the People's Republic of China. In his year at the CIA, his father was still remembered by the paucity of information about his tenure as director. No one could recall any major intelligence successes or failures on his watch. There was an absence of colorful talk to mark his days on the 7th floor. He concentrated on improving staff morale, something badly needed, and making his staff happy and keeping both himself and the agency out of the news. Viewed as an ambitious politician when he was appointed, From the day he arrived at Langley, he set out to show that partisan politics had no place on his agenda. Battered by successive investigations, his staff breathed a collective sigh of relief. They even came to admire the way George Herbert Bush reached outside the agency to pick defeated Republican candidates to fill key jobs. Inside Langley, he promoted men who had demonstrated their ability in the lower ranks. Overall, he had shown shrewdness and skills that revitalized the CIA at a time when it badly needed it. The Washington intelligence community was collectively shocked when President Jimmy Carter, despite all the evidence he had received of George Bush's competency, promptly fired him. It was seen by many as an act of peculiar viciousness, a reflection that Carter was lacking in structured intellect. During his election campaign, Carter had run against the CIA. He saw it as part of the Washington sophistication he held in high suspicion. To him, Bush had stood for secrecy and was a Washington insider. By the way, this is an aside, but of course, what's not being said here, probably the real reason that Carter was suspicious, both specifically of Bush and Bush's cadre in the CIA, was their involvement in trying to get him not elected in relationship to the October surprise, right, and all of that.
Well, I believe that this was
this was later on, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean I believe that we saw after which officially out of the CIA, the rise of what was known as Team B and a lot of the intrigue. Basically, one of the first manifestations of the modern day neoconservatives as we know it within this almost as I guess you could almost call it like a bit of like a rebellious aspect after like the CIA shakeup. But this is a kind of a little bit more maybe like a lionization of like George Herbert Walker Bush than we would be inclined to present. But there's a lot of factors and dynamics behind the replacing of Bush and then the events that took place afterwards, which ultimately did result in Jimmy Carter losing the office of the presidency behind a lot of this, that very secrecy that we just referred to manifested through things such as the October surprise and the open efforts to sabotage any type of efforts of Jimmy Carter in terms of relations with Iran that could have led to a re-election victory, and instead, of course, brought in Ronald Reagan and the reign of everything that followed with that. So,
well, thank you for fact checking that. You're right. I jumped the gun. And actually thinking through it, of course, then it could be that there was part of the motive, of course, then in terms of Bush's then eventual involvement in what's been termed the October surprise, which actually potentially hides an even deeper involvement of certain elements of Bush's CIA cohorts in the hostage-taking Iranian revolution, installation of Khomeini, and then the cherry on top, I imagine, was the ousting of Carter and then Bush becoming the vice president of Reagan. And so I think you're right,
de facto president for much of that administration, I believe, but yes.
All right. So let's get back to the text, Seeds of Fire, China and the Story Behind the Attack on America, Gordon Thomas, page 16, chapter 1. Quote, Bush kept his own contempt for Carter under careful lock and key, like so much else he did. But Tenet knew things about Bush that few others did. There was, for instance, his view of China. Tenet had told colleagues he was reasonably certain his son shared his father's views. During his time at the CIA and later as President of the United States, George Herbert Bush had shown an admiration for China's then Supreme Leader Deng Xiaoping. And I apologize for butchering any Chinese names along the way here. I'll do my best. Quote, along with barely concealed detestation for the Chinese students who had dared to oppose Deng and the other old men of the Long March who had created China in their own image, a hardline communist state in which the very word, quote-unquote, democracy had no translation into Mandarin. It still did not. Almost certainly then the incoming president of the United States, George W. Bush, would take the same view as his father about China. One reason was that the incoming administration viewed China as a vitally important trading partner and was determined to see that European nations, especially Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, would not seriously challenge that position. The new Bush administration would balance that against knowing American memories were long. Many people could not easily forget or forgive what had happened in China a mere 9 years ago, the shocking massacre of the young students of Beijing's universities in Tiananmen Square. But there is still another reason, one far more demanding of Tenet's attention than the machinations of American businessmen seeking to deepen their collective foothold in China or the protests of American liberals. China, through its Secret Service, CSIS, had proven itself a ruthless and competent enemy of the United States. It had carried out one of the most successful intelligence operations against the very heart of America's nuclear research establishment, one at the cutting edge of the nation's defenses. The facility is Los Alamos, where the two bombs had been developed which had destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki and ended World War II. Okay, that's his editorial line on it, but we'll let that be for now. Okay, this is the end of page 16, Seeds of Fire, China and the Story Behind the Attack on America by Gordon Thomas. Quote, for almost 3 years, the FBI, under the personal command of its director, Louis J. Freeh, had probed and combed through every inch of Los Alamos, driven on by Attorney General Janet Reno, whose manner would be more remembered for a rasping voice than inspired leadership. It was Reno who had led all the network news shows earlier in 1999, with her exultant claim that a Chinese lab scientist working at Los Alamos, Dr. Wenho Lee, had been arrested as China's spy. The Taiwanese-born Lee had been incarcerated in solitary confinement in a federal prison awaiting trial on charges he had passed nuclear warhead designs to CSIS, along with a library of CD-ROM stored documents, which revealed what Reno had termed, quote, pretty well all that any enemy would need to know about our defense secrets, unquote. Tenet had not believed Lee was guilty from the time his own team made their own separate inquiries to those of the FBI. He had been proven right. In the closing weeks of 1999, Reno had been forced to order Lee's release from incarceration on the simple grounds that the FBI had uncovered no evidence even remotely substantiating any charge of espionage. The 58 felony counts against Lee were dropped, and U.S. District Court Judge James Parker took the highly unusual step of publicly apologizing to Lee for, quote, government misconduct which has embarrassed the entire nation, unquote. Tenet was not the only one who wondered how much of the apology was generated by the persistent rumors, which had percolated through the Washington intelligence community, that Lee's work at Los Alamos was so futuristic that if he revealed even a hint, it would have monumental repercussions. Lee, ran the whispers, worked on what was known as Project HP, Holographic Portal. This took Los Alamos scientists at the Lawrence Livermore and Sandia laboratories into what can be called, quote-unquote, ET technology, unquote. So this is very, we're going to skip a section here, but this is very, for folks who are interested in stuff beyond nuclear, black technology, there is a whole section here, talking about a Dr. Richard Boylan, who the author, Gordon Thomas, says has proven contacts within the National Security Agency. Okay, so that's the beginning. And now we're going to just jump ahead a few pages to page 23 to get more into the meat of what Tenet was beginning to think about and work through in relationship to the incoming George W. Bush administration at that point. Okay, page 23, Seeds of Fire, China and the Story Behind the Attack on America by Gordon Thomas. Quote, George Tenet also knew that though Lee had not been a CSIS spy, China's Secret Intelligence Service had carried out its penetration of Los Alamos almost certainly with the help of another foreign intelligence service. On paper, that service was deemed to be the closest of all friendly intelligence agencies to the American intelligence community. The service was Mossad, the external intelligence agency of Israel. When Tenet had come into office, he had read two documents written by his predecessors. The first was penned by William Casey on March 21st, 1984. Quote, "A nation creates the intelligence community it needs. America relies on technical expertise because we are concerned to discover rather than secretly rule. The Israelis operate differently. Mossad, in particular, equates its actions with its nation's survival," unquote. The second document was written by Robert Michael Gates, a mere week after he became director of the CIA on December 15th, 1986. Quote, "Mossad's most celebrated director, Meir Amit, has said that Mossad should live by the credo, Israel first, last, and always, always. We must never be caught going through the pockets of our friends. The key word is caught," unquote. Commenting on that adage, Gates had detailed Mossad's increased penetration of the United States through economic, scientific, and technological espionage. A special Israeli unit codenamed, quote-unquote, AL, A-L, Hebrew for, quote-unquote, above, had been set up to prowl through California's Silicon Valley and Boston's Route 128 for high-tech secrets. And an aside here, Greg, previously we covered this section in an Antedote show that we did in August of 2019 titled Epstein Teterboro Traffic, Maxwell Talpiot Twin Metrics, and DCI Tenet's Sino-Israeli Security Woes. And the description of that show that you wrote out, Greg, is, I'm going to read it. Quote, "This week we discussed Teterboro Airport in New Jersey, frequently used by Jeffrey Epstein, and some of the interesting traffic coming in and out of the airport. We then talk about Cargo Metrics, whose CEO, Scott Borgerson, is rumored to be in a relationship with Ghislaine Maxwell, and the key role of Cargo Metrics in the tracking of cargo delivered by sea, as well as some of its influential backers. We close by reading from Gordon Thomas's Seeds of Fire relating to former CIA Director George Tenet and nuclear treachery by both Israel and China." And so folks who want some of that background can go to that show on our Antedote YouTube channel and Patreon site. Yeah. And but we pointed out at the time that this reference in the book to AL, A-L, Hebrew for above, a special Israeli unit in the United States, was the only place that we could find on the public record, at least searching on the internet, to this secret Israeli intelligence unit. And the fact that it was so directed at signals intelligence, cyber, high technology, obviously this Boston-based Route 128. Think about how much time he spent in that area. He was deeply involved in both MIT, people from MIT, the Media Lab, people from Harvard, professors from Harvard. Meanwhile, both Maxwell and her twin sisters deeply involved in Silicon Valley, while Epstein himself was deeply involved in Silicon Valley. And so I would say my hypothesis at this point is that that it's very possible, it's non-controversial, even though it's a controversial fact. It's non-controversial at this point that the Epstein-Maxwell operation was at the very least some aspect of it was handled by some aspect of Israeli intelligence. That there's so many circumstantial facts. There's multiple sources from a former member of Israeli intelligence, Ari Ben Menashe, to a alleged victim of Epstein Maxwell, Maria Farmer, to the former business partner of Epstein himself, Steve Hoffenberg.
And also, I would add in there, Israeli-born former CBS News producer at CBS News, I believe, of the early show on CBS. Now the head of narrative, Zev Shalev, who had come out shortly before the quote-unquote death of Jeffrey Epstein, suicide of that Jeffrey Epstein was an Israeli intelligence agent. So
yeah, but that was just his only source on that was Ari Ben Menashe.
Gotcha. Okay, fair enough.
So I'm just saying there was actually sort of two people who originally reported on these sources saying this, and that was basically Zev Shalev, a narrative, and then Whitney Webb. The two of them were, we of course had been talking about it the entire Trump years, that it was obvious that it was some kind of Israeli intelligence operation, just given the connections and the background of Ghislaine Maxwell's father, quote unquote, Israel super spy, Robert Maxwell, another book that Gordon Thomas co-wrote. That book we will be touching on in future, Antedote Deepcore text shows. And so that was very, very obvious. But now we have these three sources who all say that yes, this was what it looked like. Some kind of Israeli intelligence operation. And so I guess my hypothesis at this point is to actually say that this is, we've talked about the background of LACAM, originally out of the Bureau of Scientific Liaison or Relations, I think its original name, out of like the 50s, real early in the history of the Israeli state, and how that was basically the technical intelligence side of Israeli intelligence that included eventually people like Arnon Milchan, who was brought into the fold by eventual Prime Minister Shimon Peres of Israel to follow things like nuclear trafficking, things like Krytrons, nuclear triggers. But I've also found out that it looks like it wasn't just nuclear material, and it wasn't just material; it was also information, and that's where you see that the Robert Maxwell's role in all of this. He was not only a publisher in terms of press; he's sort of like the precedent of Rupert Murdoch in many ways, in a intensely British context, but also had forays into the United States too. But he was also an owner of presses and was involved in educational material, handbooks. And so that was one of the things that he was apparently involved in too, was actually seeking out technical material from around the world and very obviously and likely delivering it to Israeli intelligence. And so that to me looks like, that's LACAM. And then you bring in Arnon Milchan, and apparently it's not just nuclear, it's also biological and chemical, which in our later segments here, which we'll skip to after these early segments, we'll skip to the back of Seeds of Fire, China and the Story Behind the Attack on America by Gordon Thomas. It points out that there is even a relationship between China and Israel relating to things like, the totality of NBC, nuclear, biological, chemical, in terms of WMD, weapons of mass destruction. And so, in short, my current hypothesis is that the Epstein-Maxwell operation was actually an AL operation. And that's why it's so obviously involved not just compromise via sexual trafficking and sexual abuse of minors to the highest levels of, Western society and governments. And as we pointed out before, the two people that you could have selected out of the entire mass of candidates for president from both sides of the aisle in 2016, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, were the two candidates with the closest history with Epstein Maxwell. And so that we think that sort of shows that this was very, very extensive and very, very powerful. And the fact that we're not actually, seeing much public discourse about how central this blackmail operation is and was to our politics is proof positive that this is AL, I would say Hebrew for above. This is above. This is the most important aspect of penetration by Israeli intelligence in an American context.
And all of this is very interesting, just even going back to New Mexico and Los Alamos and all. A couple of aspects of intrigue that were going on with relation to this is that, New Mexico, Los Alamos lab, by the way, I believe approximately 50 miles away from the Zorro Ranch that Jeffrey Epstein, it was owned and operated by Jeffrey Epstein, where some certainly activities were said to go on, to say the least. And also in the midst of this, at the same time as this, Wen Ho Lee is publicly named and identified as this as the mole within it, Los Alamos, and this is blamed on China and all this. Is placement of Bill Richardson as the energy secretary under Bill Clinton. Bill Richardson has been named and implicated as being involved in the Epstein operation. We don't want to throw out. I mean, he's been. His name's been, he's been implicated, and he's been named as a person, certainly within the Epstein, circle, so to speak, as far as, candidates for potential, compromise within, Epstein operations as it relates to politicians. So you have those aspects at play. And then also what's very interesting in the relation to this, of course, we mentioned Clinton and Trump as being the two people who are like the nearest to Jeffrey Epstein. And this is something I'm working out here myself. I'm not quite clear on this. I'm throwing this out as a hypothesis as we speak on air here, Jeremy. But think about this was in the 90s, and I'd have to go back and look at this. Throughout the Clinton administration, just as we've identified, you just talked about AI and the Israeli factor with this. And of course, one of the very...
Or AL.
Excuse me. AL. And one of the major, obviously, matters with the Clinton administration, certainly once the second half of the Clinton administration, was the very much the Israeli hand at play in terms of putting Clinton into the situation with Monica Lewinsky that ultimately led to his impeachment trial, and the very Israeli-centric hand involved with this. And on the flip side of this, you've got this aspect with China. Clinton's compromise to China was always on the table during his administration. And so, as I said, I'm hypothesizing this among you and I here as we talk, just laying this out, thinking as we're going along here, that this operation here, as we've talked before time and time again about Hillary Clinton's claim that the vast right-wing conspiracy against our family. And I think I think it's deeper than just that. I think there's a lot more at play than just that, but definitely on the surface, there was certainly constant efforts to compromise and bring the Clinton administration around to doing certain things, it seems like. And so I look at, on one hand, you have this Israeli factor at play with the Lewinsky scandal, putting all this pressure on Clinton. But at the same time, though, Clinton was constantly dogged by these accusations and allegations of being an agent of China. Very similar, history repeats itself now with Joe Biden and all the, Beijing Joe and all this, when meanwhile we just did a long-form episode breaking down the writing of Alfred McCoy about what appears to be, what Trump administration was actually accomplishing with regards to strengthening China's hand in a very detrimental manner as far as America's economic fortunes, etc. But the constant allegations dogging Clinton of being a Chinese agent and all this, and this Los Alamos intrigue, I think, was at the center of that. So I even look at the aspects of to China, like the scandal involving Clinton and China, as being an extension of this nonstop political and otherwise pressure being put on Clinton administration by this, as we've identified, this increasingly synergistic element in terms of of a particular aspect of American neoconservatives and also other, not just neoconservatives, but primarily, I think, a particular nest of neoconservatives combined with the interesting placement, perhaps, of a potentially Epstein compromised personality in the energy department. And I look at this and I wonder, is this just another extension of that whole dynamic of the the quote vast right-wing conspiracy against the Clintons, which ultimately seemed to set up like Hillary Clinton being like a perfect fall candidate to ensure that Donald Trump took the presidency. So just thinking about that out loud as we go along here.
Well, thank you for that, Greg. And before I get back to the text, I just want to point out another Antedote program that we did just a couple weeks, actually, I think, before that previous one where we dealt with Maxwell and Cargometrics and Seeds of Fire, was a show that we published in August 19th of 2019 titled Nuclear #Epstein, Cantor Fitzgerald, DeRonin, MMA Special Forces, and the other Maxwell daughters, where the description is, quote, the global Jeffrey Epstein criminal operation is about much, much more than just sexual compromise. On this episode of The Antedote, we detail several examples of how this extends into multiple areas of vital importance. Topics discuss Howard Lutnick, billionaire CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald, donor to both Trump and Clinton, and neighbor to Epstein, whose company saw 658 people die on September 11th, while Lutnick conveniently was not at the World Trade Center. And an aside on that, in the photo that we use for the show, we use a couple different screen grabs of Google Maps, pointing out that not only was he lived right next door. It's titled on Google Maps Cantor Fitzgerald next to Jeffrey Epstein's house, basically. And this is the, East 71st Street brownstone that Epstein received directly from, a mega group billionaire, Leslie Wexner, and apparently, as reported in multiple sources, fully wired up in terms of video surveillance in multiple rooms. Obviously some kind of blackmail operation, a blackmail brownstone operation delivered to Jeffrey Epstein fully intact by another grouping, really, a member of another grouping that is somehow related to above Mossad, as someone like Jerome Corsi might have titled it back when he was buddies with Alex Jones. So these two groups, the mega group and Al, I think are crucial in relationship to the highest levels of this operation that intersects but does not end with aspects of Israeli intelligence. And the other photo we used was from exactly what you were talking about, Greg, about Bill Richardson as his background as governor of New Mexico, who then becomes the head of the Department of Energy. And we were pointing out that it's the nuclear weapons are in the United States, in our context, they're not handled under DOD. They're handled under the Department of Energy. And we point out that Epstein's Zorro Ranch is just an hour from this nucleus of these nuclear laboratories that are in the New Mexico, so specifically Albuquerque area. And so that coincidence of geography was something that we were pointing out a lot. And I'll just finish reading the rest of this description because there's some other interesting pieces to this that we dealt with in that show if folks want to go back and listen to that. Quote, the possibility of Epstein-related activities being used as fronts for drug and weapons smuggling. Vladislav Doronin, referred to as the, quote, Russian Donald Trump, unquote, ex-boyfriend of Epstein flight log subject Naomi Campbell, and his relationships with Epstein and Mark Rich. Igor Zinoviev, Epstein's longtime bodyguard, who is also an ex-MMA mixed martial arts fighter and member of Soviet Special Forces. And then Christine and Isabel Maxwell, twin daughters of Robert Maxwell, and their work on behalf of Israeli technological endeavors. And I would just say that since then, actually, I haven't yet finished reading through, but Craig Unger's recently published book this year, 2021, American Compromat, brings in Epstein in relationship to the long-term KGB cultivation of Donald Trump, which was then ultimately, of course, passed over to contemporary Russian intelligence and obviously, Vladimir Putin as I think he was a KGB colonel, I believe. So this is, so there is this aspect here, this intersection. Then, we're not going to deal with this Russian aspect here, but this is also in the mix here. All right. So I just wanted to point folks there. I'll get back to the text now, unless you have something.
It all seems to go, but all these varying things seem to go back to each other, which is which is what makes it all so interesting. It's like so many of these layers that you discuss ultimately seem to go back to the same parties, and in just about every occurrence it seems.
Okay, Seeds of Fire, China and the Story Behind the Attack on America by Gordon Thomas, bottom of page 23. Quote, we just read, I'll just back up one. Quote, a special Israeli unit codenamed, quote unquote, Al, Hebrew for quote unquote above, had been set up to prowl through California's Silicon Valley and Boston's Route 128 for high-tech secrets. And aside, I just think that the prowling for high-tech secrets, when you combine what we know about the long-term strategy of the Talpiot program and the escalation by Netanyahu specifically, and amped up after the September 11th attacks as the sort of cyber dominance plan, kill switch diplomacy in terms of the quote unquote diplomatic side to this. I think you can basically make a case this goes way beyond the way that espionage, looking for secrets, is usually thought of when you couple in, if my hypothesis is correct and that Epstein Maxwell was actually an all operation, then we're obviously not talking just quote classical espionage of collecting secrets and getting information, but we're talking about hardcore compromise operations. And not just human, but also SIGINT. And as Ronan Bergman points out in his book, combines the, I believe he's a Colonel Zehevi Aharon Zevi Farkash, who was the head of Unit 8200, SIGINT, the Israeli Signals Intelligence Department agency, with the human intelligence of Meyer Dagan, I believe, into what he called Hugint, which he said Yossi Cohen, who worked in between those, was the sort of leading officer of Hugint, i.e. a synergistic merger of signals intelligence and human intelligence, which I think we really see that something like Stuxnet, the most well-known contemporary cyber operation internationally, was very obviously a Hugint operation. It involved obviously some type of collaboration between NSA hackers and Unit 8200 Israeli hackers, but then the thing was done via human agents on the ground in relationship. This is the reporting on it, that it was basically, how do you get a USB drive onto the air-gapped computer systems in the Iranian nuclear facilities so that the weaponized code could be delivered to the Siemens controllers and have them spin out of control and destroy themselves, basically. So obviously Stuxnet was a Hugint operation, and I guess my assertion here is that this is what we see. This is the tip of the spear and the tip of the iceberg, potentially, in terms of the what we're seeing with the Epstein Maxwell operation. Is espionage on a whole nother level, where it's industry-wide compromise that is then facilitated, it looks like, by old school blackmail, videos, audio-visual evidence that's hung over people's heads and the highest levels of political officers and beyond that, in terms of Silicon Valley, as we'll get into in terms of Microsoft and all of that. So that I just wanted to point that out. All right. Quote, in his report to the Senate Intelligence Committee, another of Tenet's predecessors, Bobby Ray Inman, had identified Israel as one of 6 foreign nations with a, quote, government-directed, orchestrated, and clandestine effort to steal U.S. military and economic secrets, unquote.
And I'll just throw this in here with regards to this mentioning here, because this is just one of many indicators. If you really look at like the deep history, like there is this belief, and I think rightly so, people point out like the influence of, you know, Israel lobby over American foreign policy, etc., over our politicians. But something that has long been going on, I believe that this was one of the major impacts of the Donald Trump presidency, was that the U.S. military and intelligence communities have historically been very critical of these aspects of what you're talking about here, with like but what Bobby Ray Inman described here is this Israel is one of these 6 countries that have been identified in this regard, and this has long been at play, like within aspects of the U.S. Military and intelligence communities, the understanding of like Israel by and large has not been it's great of an ally in many ways, but it has been something that I think was largely overturned by, you know, aspects of the Trump administration, and its approach with regards to Israel has been this has long been at play, whereas this threat, the potential threat, has been understood and acknowledged for a long time running now by our varying military and defense establishments. So
that's a good point, and even that concern by certain elements of you know, high level U.S. military and intelligence officers and officials basically was also sort of covered up by calling it espionage, because there is a certain amount of tolerance between and amongst allies, and it's even facilitated if you think about the relationship of the Five Eyes dynamics in terms of the unofficial sharing of domestic surveillance data, so that it can get past the domestic privacy laws that may exist in different Five Eye countries, and they can then be shared transnationally. So there's a certain tolerance for quote unquote allies and friends, countries spying on each other, and that's why I distinguish between that old school understanding of espionage as information collecting versus sabotage, penetration, compromise, compromat, penetration, and ultimately, you know, we're beginning to see things like evisceration of industry scale aspects of the United States, which, you know, the internet, Silicon Valley's titled because it's the birthplace of computer chips. And meanwhile, what are we seeing here? We're seeing a mass transfers in some way. And so this is part of the reason why we want to talk about these bigger geopolitical forces that stand behind the technicals, the cyber technicals of the latest publishing of the, you know, Microsoft China quote unquote hack, and pointing out that we're talking about decades of counterintelligence penetration here, that at its core was facilitated by human intelligence, and not just to get information, but to compromise, and not only compromise individuals, but compromise institutions, compromise technology, compromise corporations, compromise whole sectors. Okay, and so this is part of the issue here, I think, in terms of what you referenced, that even when certain elements in the United States were so concerned about this that they would raise a fuss internally, publicly, it was all just sort of swept under the rug by calling it, friends will spy on each other, rather than friends will compromise each other. Okay, so this is the key thing, and I think that, you know, the both the political, military, and the cyber professionals who are concerned about this moment really need to put some effort into understanding this much larger geopolitical open source counterintelligence analysis that deals with how did we get here, and then ultimately then that's going to have to be factored into how are we going to unwind this situation. So thank you for pointing that out, Greg.
Yeah, definitely. Good points there. By the way, you're exactly right about that. I feel like also that to quote Malcolm X, the chickens of this history of not forthrightly dealing with this has come home to roost with regards to some of the worst aspects of what the Trump presidency brought us. So,
yep. All right, so here we are, page 24, Seeds of Fire, China and the Story Behind the Attack on America by Gordon Thomas. All right, so we just referred to the Bobby Ray Inman saying that he had identified Israel as one of 6 foreign nations with a, quote, government-directed, orchestrated, and clandestine effort to steal U.S. military and economic secrets, unquote. Page 24. Quote, Tenet had not forgotten that another on the list was China. Now, though he still could not prove it in a way that a court of law would demand proof, he was very certain that the Los Alamos operation had been a joint venture between Mossad and CSIS. For China, the accruing benefits had been easy to understand. Access to secrets that no other country possessed. For Israel, those secrets were also beyond price. But to share them with China, Israel had demanded an extra price. Access to other technology that China was developing, which would give Israel a lead over its Arab neighbors in such vital areas as agriculture, water desalination, and the other requirements that would ensure the country would continue to prosper and blossom in the arid landscape of their forefathers. Israel would also receive China's latest weapons technology, as advanced as that of the United States. George Tenet, so his friends later said, had thought long and hard about how much of all of this he should reveal to the Bush transition team. Those same friends had no doubt that, as his limousine eased its way through the traffic on its 9-mile journey into Washington, the question would still be uppermost in his mind. Tenet knew this morning that he could have been driven on the first stage of his journey back into civilian life. When he had finished briefing the transition team on secrets some may have merely suspected and others would have no previous idea about, his work as Director of Central Intelligence could be all but over. Soon a newcomer would enjoy his privileges, and for George Tenet, the most satisfying had been the right to be driven anywhere he wanted to go in this state-of-the-art limousine, which would pass on to his successor. The Lincoln Continental was the latest model. Its CIA chauffeur had passed the most demanding driving course in the world. By his right knee, within instant reach, was a compartment containing a pump-action shotgun. The car's armor had added some 2,000 pounds to the Lincoln's original weight. An armored rear partition and windshield had been integrated into the body shell. The doors were similarly protected, as was the roof. The titanium ceramic armor had been tested to withstand a 155-millimeter shell air bursting overhead, or a 10-pound mine detonating under the chassis. All the windows were proofed against 50-caliber armor-piercing bullets. Built into the passenger compartment was an oxygen mask and fire suppression system, a global positioning indicator accurate to within 1 meter, and a jam-resistant satellite communications switchboard, which could reach CIA headquarters, the Pentagon, or the Oval Office in the White House. It could also contact Air Force One, anywhere in the world at the press of a button. In the event of the limousine's tires being shot out, the Lincoln would still be able to maintain a speed of 60 miles per hour on the steel rims of its wheels. The Lincoln had replaced the Oldsmobile that former directors had used. Inside the vehicle, George Tenet felt as invulnerable as it was possible to be. Seated in the back seat heading towards the Beltway may well have been the moment when, as he had so often done before, he reached for his hand-tooled leather attaché case to study the briefing papers, the ones he would use this time to address the transition team. Each document was in its own coded file. Each briefing paper ran to no more than 3 pages, the maximum length Tenet liked briefs to be. all bore the acronym, quote, bigot list, unquote. This was a definition that the material was for a small select group of people entitled to see reports from a particularly sensitive agent or from an espionage operation. Apart from the President of the United States, the material was seen by the National Security Advisor, the White House Chief of Staff, the White House Chief Legal Counsel, the Attorney General, and the Secretary of State. Each document also carried the standard stamp classification, quote, top secret, unquote. This signified that it included material whose disclosure could be expected to cause either exceptionally serious national security damage or create international political damage. That the transition team would now be privy to such data was a calculated risk Tenet had taken. Despite the picket line of restrictions surrounding each document, and he would preface his introduction by saying no document would be left behind. This was before no child left behind. No document left behind. He knew that there was always the possibility of a leak to either the Post or the New York Times. That had always been the nature of secrecy in Washington. Two of the documents concerned the Russian mafia. The first dealt with the mafia's relationship with the Mossad. It contained the revelation that the Israeli agency could soon be asked to move its European headquarters in Holland, following highly embarrassing claims that Mossad had been secretly buying plutonium and other nuclear materials from the Russian mafia. The allegation had come from a CIA agent in Amsterdam who had picked it up from Intel, the small but formidable division of Dutch intelligence. Intel operated from a deep bunker near Amsterdam Central Railway Station. The bunker had ironically been built to shelter the Dutch royal family in the event of a Soviet nuclear attack on the city at the height of the Cold War. The CIA agent's report said that most of the nuclear material had been stolen by the mafia from Russian weapons labs such as Chelyabinsk 70 in the Ural Mountains and Arsama 16 in Nizhny Novgorod, formerly Gorky. Senior Mossad officers had insisted to Intel that precisely because the deadly materials were stolen, their agents had purchased them from the Russian mafia.
As an aside here, you're just seeing, once again, the constant, when you look deeply into these issues of like nuclear intrigue and as it relates to what we're talking about, discussing here with relation to China and Los Alamos and what's been going through there, and now bringing it back once again to Russia and Israel and this global Soviet, organized crime syndicate based out of the former Soviet Union. It just continues to go back to these same vitally important areas that are always seem to pop up in this intrigue, and you always behind the scenes is with whether it's China or Russia. By and large, it seems like with relation to these intrigues is always that Israeli hidden hand, and I guess with relation to the Russian factor, it would be a combination of Israel, but also the very, very, very Zionist-centric aspects of the global organized crime syndicate, but always in these areas of intrigue. It seems like the same parties are popping up with the hidden hand of Israel right there in the center of it. So,
yes, and two things. Wasn't it? I believe it was Dutch cyber intelligence were the ones who really got the most of any of our allied intelligence services. They were the ones who got the goods, actually, on the 11/9 operation, on the Trump, quote-unquote, Trump-Russia operation that also was transnational and most obviously directly connected to a whole bunch of leadership in the Middle East, including Israel, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. And I believe it was the Dutch cyber intelligence that got video, actually, of some of the cyber warfare farms. And I'm not sure if it was the intelligence, the IRA was the one that they got they hacked the video and they got actually video from outside showing people going inside and all of that, or another one of the operations. But I think that's interesting to just note. And then the other thing to note is that often when there are these, think of think of things like the shoe bomber. There is very often a connection to Schiphol Airport. There's a Dutch connection, and the rumors are that this is where Israeli intelligence is set up in a similar way. The Dutch intelligence is close to this railway station, I think they said. So I just wanted to point that out. There's this. This is an interesting background to understand the Dutch connection here.
Yeah, it was a Cozy Bear, by the way, that the Dutch intelligence had been following and tracking and got tape of. So
very interesting. So there's a long history here in terms of the Dutch eye on Russian mob movement, and then obviously as we saw come to the forefront in a way that's still not really just talked about openly, even though it's all over official documents, it's all over official reporting. This was not just Trump-Russia. This was Trump-Russia-Israel to some large extent, or at the very, maybe we should talk about it as the actual specific people. This was Trump, Putin, Netanyahu, Mohammed bin Salman, Mohammed bin Zayed, al-Sisi. These were the figures who were involved in this operation. And once again, the Dutch are paying attention to what's going on and trying to inform the Americans about what the heck is going down in relationship to the Russian mob and Israeli intelligence, I would say. I mean, we don't know that part of the background of what the Dutch picked up in terms of the 11/9 operation. But.
Yes, and when it comes to like what you just talked about there with the with the Russian aspect and Russian mob and Israel, increasingly when it comes to Putin, when it comes to Netanyahu, when it comes to Trump, you can't have one without the other. And people continue to make the same mistake of like these entities are all like somehow independent of each other, or one doesn't apply to the other, when increasingly it is a continuity between these three entities, particularly these individuals and the people around them, combined with the other players that you mentioned, such as Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. You cannot have one without the other. And I think that's an area where people increasingly continue to, knowingly or unknowingly, have a very mistaken belief that you can. So,
okay. Thank you, Greg. All right. Seeds of Fire, China and the Story Behind the Attack on America by Gordon Thomas, bottom of page 25. Quote, senior Mossad officers had insisted to Intel that precisely because the deadly materials were stolen, their agents had purchased them from the Russian mafia. It was the only sure way to stop the materials from being sold to Islamic and other terrorist groups. While conceding that the Mossad claim was plausible, Intel investigators had become convinced the nuclear materials had been secretly shipped out of Amsterdam's Schiphol airport to boost Israel's own nuclear weapons manufacturing plant at Dimona in the Negev desert. Already stockpiled there were an estimated 200 nuclear weapons. And an aside, there's just a recent story in the last week of new construction going on in Dimona, which is very interesting. All right, page 26 of Seeds of Fire, China and the Story Behind the Attack on America. And this specific section is titled Seeds of Fire, China's Voices of Conscience, the Third Millennium. Okay, quote, for Tenet, knowing Mossad was trafficking with the Russian mafia had rekindled a nuclear nightmare that has never quite gone away. While the Cold War doctrine of MAD, mutually assured destruction, was a thing of the past among the superpowers, in its place was a more dangerous scenario where nuclear know-how and materials were on sale. It was capitalism, Wild East style, in which organized crime syndicates and corrupt government officials worked in league to create new markets for nuclear materials, a bazaar with some of the world's most dangerous weapons on offer. Much of the work of tracing the stolen nuclear material was done at the European Trans-Uranium Institute, ETUI, in Karlsruhe, Germany. There, scientists used state-of-the-art equipment to track whether stolen materials had come from a military or civilian source. But the CIA agent in Amsterdam conceded, quote, it's like trying to catch a thief who has never been fingerprinted, unquote. To head off undoubtedly awkward questions, should Mossad's own fingerprints be found? The Israeli Services Director General, Ephraim Halevi, had made a secret visit to Holland to explain Mossad's role to Intel. The Dutch service was still not convinced. The CIA report concluded that Intel had recommended to the Dutch government that Mossad should be asked to move its European headquarters in the El Al complex at Schiphol Airport. Mossad had been based there for the past 6 years. From second-floor offices in the complex, known at Schiphol as, quote, Little Israel, unquote, 18 Mossad officers run European operations, right? And those are Mossad, 18 Katzas, Mossad officers. And eventually we'll read through some of Viktor Ostrovsky's book, which is the widest writing on the actual methods of Mossad. And they work very, very light in terms of command structure. They have very few Katzas, intelligence officers worldwide. So 18 in one place is obviously a hub, as they're saying. This is not only the hub of the Mossad's Dutch operations. This is the hub of Mossad's European theater operations. And Ostrovsky also then points out that the way that they're able to deal so top light in terms of their intelligence operations is via the use of the Zionim, of Jews worldwide who have Zionist leanings and or strong Israeli loyalty, who can be called on to actually act as basically, agents of Israeli intelligence while being off the books and not being officers. So it's a fairly unique situation in terms of internationally, in terms of intelligence organization. So I just wanted to note that 18 Katzas in one place is a big Israeli intelligence operation, I would say. Okay. Page 20, middle of page 26, Seeds of Fire by Gordon Thomas. Quote, the second part of the Russian Mafia report also dealt with its unusual relationship with Israel. The report detailed Israel's decision to allow a Russian mafia boss, Semyon, he spells it Semyon Yukovich Mogilevich, to travel on one of its passports. CIA's London station had attached an MI5 report which described Mogilevich as, quote, one of the world's top criminals. Substantial sums of hard currency have been provided to Saddam Hussein by this man from the sale of Iraqi oil allowed to be sold under United Nations sanctions. Mogilevich has laundered the money around the world for Saddam, unquote. And aside here, I think this is also, if you go back and look at some of the history of Mark Rich, and we're going to touch, we'll eventually read through Gary Vogler's book, what is it called? Politics of Oil, Iraq and the Politics of Oil.
Yes.
That has a background, basically, of some of what was going on in terms of these networks that were operating on behalf, or at the very least interfacing in relationship to Israeli interests, Mark Rich being one of the most obvious. And so it's interesting in that description of that one show that we did about the Naomi Campbell's connection to Epstein and her relationship with Doron and the Russian oligarch. What do they call him? The Bill Gates? What was they call him? The Bill Gates of Russia? What were they saying about him? I forget. Do you remember what that was?
I'm not.
Oh, no. The Russian Donald Trump. He's not. Yeah, he's not into Microsoft. He's actually a real estate guy. That's right. He's the Russian Donald Trump.
It's interesting going what you just said there with Mogilevich and Saddam Hussein, and then what's been put out there regarding the I forget where the information comes from, but basically Maxwell promised from the hands of Maxwell Mogilevich, and then ultimately it's been alleged that even Bin Laden had a copy of had access to promise as a result of dealings with Maxwell, and then through Maxwell, Mogilevich to Bin Laden. He's seeing the constant propping up financially and otherwise of those who would later become the enemies for to be brought down in the ensuing war on terror.
Very, very interesting. And that was what was alleged to have been Mark Rich's involvement too, was both in relationship to Iran and Iraq, and being able to sort of skirt some of these American restrictions. So, all right, back to page 26 of Seeds of Fire, China and the Story Behind the Attack on America by Gordon Thomas. Quote, the report detailed how one of America's largest and oldest banks, the Bank of New York, has been caught up in a maelstrom of money laundering orchestrated by Mogilevich. It was in the records of the conservative and until now well-regulated institution that the first clues had emerged about the secret deal Saddam had struck with the mafia baron. The Bank of New York was the end of a quote-unquote laundering journey. Once quote-unquote clean, the money was used by Mogilevich to provide Saddam Hussein with billions of U.S. dollars in hard currency. The Saddam deal was only a small part of an unprecedented money laundering operation. Banks as far apart as Germany and Australia had formed part of the money laundering chain Mogilevich had created. The CIA now believed Mogilevich had the financial resources available through his global criminal network to equal that of a medium-sized nation. And an aside here, because I don't think that he covers it here, because this book I think was before Robert Maxwell, Israel's Super Spy, that Gordon Thomas co-wrote with Martin Dillon, where he actually goes into the background that Mogilevich learned this money laundering strategies, how to set up these instruments, from Robert Maxwell himself, who is a master of the craft. So that then is an interesting piece of this puzzle, I would say. Okay, bottom of page 26, Seeds of Fire by Gordon Thomas. Quote, he had entered the Western financial world in 1988 when the Bank of New York began to aggressively seek business in Russia. Their contact man in the former Soviet Union was Bruce Rapport, a Swiss banker. Born in Haifa, Israel, the 50-year-old Rapport ran an investment brokerage out of a modest office in Geneva. He operated in, among other places, Oman, Liberia, and Haiti before setting up in New York. Within 5 years, he had established himself through investments as one of the Bank of New York's biggest individual stockholders. Using that position, he offered to open doors for the bank in Russia. At some point, Mogilevich saw his opportunity to use the Bank of New York for money laundering. The CIA report revealed that investigators have now traced close to $5 billion that was laundered through one bank account in 1 month in 1999. All told, over $10 billion had passed through the account in the next 6 weeks. Like a number of other Russian criminals, the CIA had taken steps to ensure that Mogilevich was barred from entering the United States or Britain. Meantime, he continued to travel between Moscow and Budapest. And aside, of course, there is, Thomas is alleging the CIA had taken steps to ensure that Mogilevich was barred from entering the United States or Britain. And as we know, I think just a little bit later on than this, Mogilevich had inroads with the former heads of the FBI. It looks like, right? I think, so there was some kind of high-level greasing of a wheel here at some level. And when you go look back at the history of Epstein, Maxwell, or September 11th, for that matter. I believe
in particular referring to William Sessions and Louis Freeh, correct?
I believe so. Yes. Look into the background of where they became representatives of some sort to lobby on behalf of Mogilevich. And Mogilevich was at some point, a top criminal on the most wanted list for FBI. And then he was taken off.
Mr. James Comey.
So this is the wake of all of this at some level. And so, similarly, look at the background of Epstein, the impunity over long years Just think of the crime in terms of against, of minors, against girls, in terms of that, and that impunity, and then scale that impunity and those sex crimes and violations of girls that was a piece of a much larger national security compromise at the highest levels of our government. We've already mentioned people that, either ran for president, were the head of the Department of State, became president, were governors of New Mexico, became the head of the Department of Energy. These are people who are implicated in this long-term operation. And so Mogilevich not getting into the country is maybe the least of some concerns, potentially. All right, back to the text, page 27. Read a few more pages of this early piece here, and then we'll move on. Quote, meantime, he continued to travel between Moscow and Budapest. Remember, Budapest Bridge. Go look up those articles. Budapest Bridge in relationship to the Trump-Russia 11/9 operation. Budapest. So it's similar. Just one aside here, just to make this clear. The way that Amsterdam is recognized as the epicenter of Israeli intelligence operations in the European theater, Budapest is seen as the epicenter of Russian intelligence operations in the European theater. And what you see is multiple characters from the Trump operation showing up, moving through Budapest a lot in the run-up to the 2016 election. All right. And we're actually eventually also going to read through the Steele dossier, which one of the most, things that's been supposedly debunked from it, and maybe it's been fact-checked, is that Michael Cohen, I think, was in the Czech Republic or something like that, and supposedly he has an alibi, and but there's a whole background there that we'll get into later when we deal more with the Trump-Russia 11/9 operation and Budapest Bridge and all that. But I just wanted to note that as that came up. Okay, so middle of page 27, Seeds of Fire by Gordon Thomas. Quote, no criminal activity was too small to catch his eye, his being Semyon Mogilevich. As Jews prepared to leave the former Soviet Union for Israel, he told them they would need hard currency in the West. He took their art, jewelry, and other valuables and sold them. They never saw him again, unquote. And just a quick aside here, too, is now with referencing Unger's recent book, American Kompromat, it basically says that this was, more and more we can see this as the Russian deep state, that even these sort of criminal operations that Mogilevich is running, where it looks like it's just sort of fleecing his fellow Jews in their, move to what they see as better situations, that there is also on top of that, i.e. the actual deep state, the underworld black economy, the Dawn of Dawns, the gangsters, the Russian mob. Then on top, you have the actual national security apparatus, the covert operations, national security commanding heights, right? And those are fused in what we actually should know as the deep state. And what Unger exposes in his most recent book is that basically from Yuri Shvets, is that his name, Greg?
Yuri Shvets, yes, I believe so.
That this was done to probably 90% of Jewish emigres from the Soviet Union, I think is the number that he gave, that basically from a then Soviet intelligence angle, that 90% of Jews were basically under some kind of enforced compromise, that they basically signed a contract. It's sort of similar. It was sort of like the inverse of the Israeli intelligence operation in terms of the helpers. This was the slaves. This was the people who were buying their freedom with a contractual subservience to Soviet intelligence to call on them to do things once they reached where they were going. Most obviously, the United States is what plays into the long-term aspect of the cultivation of Donald Trump as a long-term KGB intelligence asset then eventually Russian intelligence asset.
Yeah, I think that needs to be delved into more in depth in the future. I think that's a pretty big revelation there, and that's something to be dealt with in the future. I think just the ramifications of that.
I agree. All right, let's get back into this. All right, we are on page 27 of Seeds of Fire by Gordon Thomas. Quote, as Jews prepared to leave the former Soviet Union for Israel, he told them they would need hard currency in the West. He took their art, jewelry, and other valuables and sold them. They never saw him again. Although, like I pointed out, they might have seen someone in an American context pop up from Soviet intelligence and ask for a quote-unquote favor, which people need to go look at what's actually being talked about in the American Compromat book by Unger and the relationship of Sam Kislin in relationship to an outpost of Soviet intelligence in relationship to Donald Trump and him purchasing televisions for Condor Hotel. One of these hotels, I can't remember. All right, back to the text here, page 27 of Seeds of Fire. Quote, while George Tenet remained uncertain what action, if any, the transition team would take on such matters once its members assumed power, he was certain they would be stunned by the documents he would present to them. Who could not be? He had told his aides before setting off to brief the team. Many of the documents had dealt with the activities of Mossad, but that could not be helped. Long before Tenet had come to be Director of Central Intelligence, Mossad had been a problem for the United States. Equally, his own confidential briefings about the transition team members showed that a number had strong anti-Israeli leanings. That's interesting. I wonder who he's talking about there. I don't know. That's interesting. Quote, what would they say, for instance, to his detailed revelation that Israel had obtained 3 German-built submarines capable of launching nuclear warheads and hitting any target within a 900-mile range of its shores? Each Dolphin-class submarine could carry 24 cruise missiles. Equipped with nuclear warheads, each missile would have a destructive power greater than the Hiroshima bomb, displacing 1,720 tons and costing $350 million apiece. The combined destructive power of the 3 submarines gave Israel a total seaborne nuclear arsenal equal to its already powerful land and air capability. Already successful missile test firings have been carried out by 2 of the submarines in the Indian Ocean. The CIA report on the submarines revealed that the National Security Agency in Washington and U.S. Navy surveillance had placed 2 of the submarines patrolling some 500 miles off the Persian Gulf in early December 1999. The 3rd submarine had been pinpointed at its dockyard in Haifa. It was expected to take up its station in the Mediterranean shortly. All 3 submarines had begun their journey from the German dockyard at Kiel on April 21st, 1999. A few days before, over 100 Israeli sailors had arrived in the port city. They had been booked into small hotels near the Hawald Schwarzko. That's my German pronunciation. It's probably the worst, actually, here. I'm going to try my best. Hawald Schwarzko Deutsche Werft shipyard. There, under tight security, the 3 submarines had been built. Shipyard workers believed the boats were for the German Navy. Only the yard's top management and the German Ministry of Defense knew the submarines were for Israel. At dusk on April 21st, the Israeli sailors arrived at the shipyard. They were members of an elite group known as quote-unquote Force 700. Each man had been trained to crew the nuclear subs. Part of that training had been in the United States. The men of Force 700 divided up into 35 officers and ratings for each submarine. In addition, each boat carried 5 quote-unquote specialists. They would be responsible for the cruise missiles that would be fitted to each vessel once it reached Israel. Their journey to the Navy dockyard at Haifa would have been impossible without the covert support of the Madrid government after discreet pressure had been applied by President Clinton. The Spanish government's permission was required for the submarines to pass through its territorial waters on the journey to Israel. By the way, an aside here, right, the timing of this, right, is post Lewinsky. Remember, there was, Clinton was already deeply involved with Jeffrey Epstein in the much earlier 90s.
Yes, and the Prime Minister of Spain at this time would have been Jose Maria Aznar, who was a very, very vocal supporter of the war in Iraq. Who later went on to be on the, I believe, board of directors for News Corp, the Fox News parent company. So,
and then the Madrid train bombings on March 3/11, 2003 was that when they were?
It was 2004. Was after.
Oh, 2004, right. They were while he was still in office. Is that correct? I think so.
I believe so. He was prime minister from 1996 to 2004, so it would have been right around. It would have been around time his reign his time as prime minister was wrapping up.
And there was rising strong Spanish dissent against the Iraq War at that point, and then. Boom go the trains. The trains tend to go boom in relationship to the geopolitics of the war on terror is what you begin to see, I would say. That's just my assertion. And then it's interesting there, we actually delved into a little bit of Aznar, a relationship he had with Václav Havel. Oh, not Klaus. Oh, right. We were talking about the Klaus relationship, in a different manner, I guess.
Was Václav Havel in relation to Jose Maria Aznar?
And Sharansky, wasn't it? Wasn't that the triplicate?
Yes, it was. Yes.
He's another key character. So we'll return to all of these characters. There's a lot of different sources that touch towards these characters. Okay, so I just wanted to point out the timing of this in terms of Clinton weighing on Spain in relationship to these German submarines that the Israelis then deployed their nuclear missiles onto. Okay. Page 28, Seeds of Fire by Gordon Thomas, around the middle here. The, quote, the Spanish government's permission was required for the submarines to pass through its territorial waters on the journey to Israel. Tenet planned to explain how both Washington and Madrid were assured that the submarines would not be equipped with cruise missiles with nuclear warheads. Then he would add that, not for the first time, Israel had duped both Spain and Washington. Critical to masking its true intentions had been a number of secret visits Mossad director Ephraim Halevi made to both Madrid and Washington earlier in 1999. He had been chosen by Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak because Halevi is a former Israeli ambassador to Brussels and a seasoned diplomat. And here's another key point and an aside here that I want to point out around Halevi, and we'll get into this when we get into the background of James Jesus Angleton, or James Jesus Angleton, is that there was always this talk of the Angleton's closeness with the Israelis, even things about he would stop on his way home from the office with people that were never identified and spend the whole night drinking whiskey or something, finish whole bottles of liquor with them. And what came out in The Ghost, Jefferson Morley's The Ghost, about Angleton, was how close a relationship Angleton had with Halevi, actually, going way back, way back there. And Angleton will be a crucial character that we seek to unpack. He's well known as the dawn of U.S. counterintelligence and the guy who was allegedly trying to uncover a Soviet monster plot, but which everybody, recognizes basically paralyzed the CIA, quote unquote, unintentionally. And that also he was not only the head of the counterintelligence desk, he was also the head of the Israel desk for the Central Intelligence Agency. And more, we begin to see him in a light that very much relates to his long-term, very, very close friend. Maybe more, we don't know. But there's very strange allegations in relationship to Angleton to Kim Philby and the Cambridge spy circle. And the missing fifth element of the Cambridge spy circle which has been described in a book subtitled The Soviet Super Spy as potentially Victor Rothschild. A very interesting background there. And so Angleton more and more begin to see in a very strange light that goes way beyond just some kind of closeness with Israel. But more and more really look carefully at how did he end up basically crippling U.S. counterintelligence right in the middle of the Cold War in relationship to his monster plot, quote-unquote, delusions and stuff like that. And meanwhile, there's this long-term, really close relationship with Halevi, who shows up at these key moments in these key areas, and of course then is head of Mossad for September 11th, too. All right, back to the text. Page 28, Seeds of Fire, China and the Story Behind the Attack on America by Gordon Thomas. Okay, so, quote, Halevi is a former Israeli ambassador to Brussels and a seasoned diplomat. He took charge of Mossad in 1995, a time when Israel believed Iran would have the capability of launching a nuclear strike against Israel by 2002. Halevi had helped to convince the Israeli government it must develop a seaborne nuclear capability, able to destroy military targets in Iran, Iraq, or Libya. In 1997, the order for the submarines was placed with the German shipyard. No one was told that the nuclear warheads for the cruise missiles would come from Israel's nuclear arsenal in the Negev desert. Halevi's visit to Madrid was to obtain agreement for the 3 submarines to stay as close as possible to the Spanish coastline during their passage to Haifa. Spain, according to the CIA document Tenet would reveal to the Transition Committee, only agreed after President Clinton had reassured Madrid that the submarines would have no nuclear capability. And aside here, you remember part of that might have just been self-interest, you know, in terms of, you remember what Martin Creveld said, I believe he was a professor, but he basically said that the Samson option is Israel's nuclear option included nuclear missiles pointed at European capitals, basically. So there might have just been some very basic self-interest in relationship to Spanish desire for Israel to not deploy nuclear warheads on the German-supplied submarines that they were going to help port to Israel. All right, back to the text here. Bottom of page 28, Seeds of Fire by Gordon Thomas. Quote, the 3 Dolphin-class subs, each 176 feet long, were allowed to negotiate Spanish waters. A few days later, they reached their pens at Haifa. By then, Halevi had persuaded Madrid and Washington to approve of the submarines carrying out sea trials in the Atlantic. The submarines once more passed through Spanish territorial waters. Out in the Atlantic, the boats headed south. They passed around the Cape of Good Hope into the Indian Ocean. Off the coast of Sri Lanka, the submarines conducted their program of test firings. Using conventional warheads, the missiles hit Israeli targets moored some 900 miles away. The program of tests was completed while the Camp David negotiations were failing. I did not realize that timing. That's interesting. Oh boy. Okay. Page 29, quote, unlike some of his predecessors, George Tenet knew the importance of holding his audience from the outset, preferably with a story that had a positive outcome. So he intended to recreate for them an intelligence operation which showed, despite the great technological advances of the past few years, that human intelligence gathered by spies on the ground was still of critical importance. He would tell them the story of the rockets of North Korea. Okay, there's a whole important piece in here, but we're already pretty far into our segment here. So I'm proposing that we skip ahead to later on in the book, if that's cool, Greg.
Yes, let's go for it. But man, there's so much. There's just so many layers to all this, and it's I mean, just right there, what you unpacked was a mouthful. But yeah, let's keep moving ahead here.
Okay, and we're going to skip over the middle of this book is really interesting too, because it also deals with the background of a promise and Robert Maxwell's involvement in distributing the backdoored promise software, which ultimately makes its way apparently into the heart of the U.S. nuclear establishment, especially in New Mexico. And there's there's a whole something like 50 pages of source documents published in the middle of Seeds of Fire, China and the Story Behind the Attack on America by Gordon Thomas. And I'll just read the first page of it, basically, so people get an idea what some of the source material is page 95, quote, Computer Law Association 30th Anniversary Program, May 3rd and 4th, 2001, Monarch Hotel, Washington, D.C., World Computer and Internet Law Congress presentation, quote, Managing the Global Digital Information Technology Explosion, unquote, by Inslaw Incorporated, luncheon address by William A. Hamilton, May 3rd, 2001, the largest global software theft in history. It's titled down at the bottom. And so then it has the whole talk here and the background of Inslaw and Promise and how it was stolen via elements of the U.S. Justice and establishment, and then ultimately by Rafi Eitan and Israel, and then ultimately trucked and bartered by Robert Maxwell under his operations as a distributor of, think about it, like the Maxwell twins, I think it was both Isabel and Christina were involved in software that was then sold to the FBI post 9/11, right? So their father was already involved in like the bowels of software and espionage a generation earlier, really. So, all right. So skipping through that, there's just a ton of interesting documentation there, source material, FBI, justice, stuff directly from the Hamiltons who created the software. And so we're going to skip all the way to towards the end of the book, page 470. All right. This is where it gets into the actual operation that Chinese and Israeli intelligence did together and some of the background of that. Okay, Seeds of Fire, China and the Story Behind the Attack on America by Gordon Thomas. We're skipping to page 470 towards the top. Quote, Privacy International, a London-based human rights group, claims that from 2001 onwards, interesting date, visitors to China will end up on anywhere up to 300 interlinked databases. Within this system, every foreigner becomes caught in a surveillance web enveloping everything they do and spend. What they order from hotel room service, what emails they send via their laptops, when and how they change their money into Chinese currency, who they talk to and dine with, what kind of transport they use. It is all recorded on one of these databases. Like much else it was creating, China was determined to be a leader of a surveillance society through information technology to police the morals, thoughts, and behavior of all of its citizens. Already hundreds of thousands of cameras have been placed on buses, trains, and elevators. Many Chinese expect to be routinely filmed from the moment they leave home. Hidden cameras are installed in cinemas, alongside roads, in bars, dressing rooms, and housing estates. Once viewed as a blunt tool of surveillance, such devices in the space of 15 years have become a benign, integral part of the urban Chinese infrastructure. It is the integration of surveillance with their day-to-day environment that is most telling. Visual surveillance has also become a fixed component in the Chinese design of modern urban centers, new housing areas, public buildings, and even throughout the road system. Soon people spy technology will be engineered into all forms of architecture and design. It is perhaps only a matter of time before the regime installs the cameras into all homes. Surveillance has become a design component in all Chinese information technology. Systems architects are required to design technology that will capture, analyze, and present personal information. Accordingly, the workplace is fast becoming a surveillance zone. Electronic supervisors analyze every minute of the working day, checking on performance rates, toilet breaks, and personal activities. Chinese citizens are routinely entrapped into handing over their data. Dozens of laws force them to disclose personal information that is then used for unrelated purposes. Government surveillance has infiltrated every element of communications networks. Telecommunications companies are required by law to ensure that their equipment is, quote, wiretap friendly, unquote. I just want to point out one other side thing here, too, is that once we get into such sources as The Startup Nation by Dan Senor and I think Saul Singer, that has a chapter that points out that 90% of Chinese telecommunications companies had Israeli technology in terms of switching components and sort of the heart of telecommunications technology infrastructure. And then I think also in the Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism by Naomi Klein, in the second to last chapter about how Israel became a mall to the world in terms of homeland security and counterterrorism technology post 9/11. That it talks about the relationship with China. And then one other resource that I think is connected here is James Bamford's book, The Shadow Factory, about the NSA, and the two chapters of Wire Tappers and Techno Tyranny that talk about how the NSA contracted out mass surveillance, mass taps on the American population to Israeli corporations. And so something similar, it looks like to me, happened in a Chinese context in relationship to their surveillance state, that the Israeli technology is at the epicenter, or is part of the built backbone of the Chinese surveillance state. And I don't know what that looks like to this day, but all we've seen is that China and Israel have grown closer and closer and closer in a even much more public fashion in what was described as marrying Israeli technology or innovation to Chinese industrial capacity. And I have many suspicions even about certain kinds of in-motion identity management software that was developed even by the formerly aforementioned Aharon Zevi Farkash, the former head. I think he was actually the head of Israeli military intelligence in general, Amman, but was also the head of Unit 8200. And he came up with in motion, meaning like where it's basically not just facial recognition, it's gait recognition. When you're walking, it recognizes your movement patterns, the way that your body moves in space. And that he started a company named after him called FST, Farkash, Security Technologies or something like that. And on the board was a Mark Rich associate. On the board was Ehud Barak himself. And a whole bunch of, Amdocs guys and all of that. And then that company then ends up sort of somehow going out of business as they were apparently beginning to retail the technology in a commercial fashion all around the world. It looked like they were being highly successful. And then allegedly it goes down and one of the Amdocs guys cut off the commercial sector and took over the technology. And I still wonder where the security technology, the state level surveillance technology of the in-motion identity management technology started by the former head of Israeli military intelligence in Unit 8200 went. And my suspicion is it actually went to the heart of China, actually. Now, that's just my suspicion, but I want to pay attention to these kinds of contemporary motions of Israel and China and their technological relationship.
And while it is indeed just a hypothesis, just a hunch, I mean, it's something that I think you good reason to have those suspicions and perhaps look into that direction as we've identified in the past, and we'll continue to identify in the future some of the very interesting overlapping between Israel and China when it comes to matters related to things such as surveilling of the the minority Muslim populations in particularly in Xinjiang province. We'll get back to that in the future, but just throwing that out there.
True, Greg, and Eric Prince's transnational connections, Israel, UAE, China, Russia. He's all over the place. So he's a key piece that we'll return to in relationship to that.
Vincent Chenguiz, as well as Benjamin Netanyahu's former chief of staff, Ari Harrow, among other people. So there's a lot there.
Okay, bottom of page 470 of Seeds of Fire, China and the Story Behind the Attack on America by Gordon Thomas. Quote, the state can do more or less as it pleases with data in the name of law enforcement, public interest, public health, national security, or national revenue. Chinese are obliged through an increasing number of laws and technologies to disclose details. Disclosure of their identity sits at the heart of all Chinese technology. But the nightmare vision of Big Brother is a reality of every entity, citizen, state, and corporation, working in partnership to achieve an alleged, quote, common good, unquote. Chinese citizens and businesses routinely are advised that they have a responsibility to support authoritarian measures. At a variety of levels, they are all expected to become partners in surveillance. The last vestiges of trust and privacy, two treasured concepts, have long ago been removed from Chinese minds. No building in Beijing or any other Chinese city, town, or hamlet across the country could operate efficiently without microchips, which constantly feed the great banks of computers by which the government keeps track of its citizens from the moment they were born until death. Ironically, much of this has been possible due to China's theft of U.S.-created technology. The country had survived the economic meltdown that had been predicted for it in the 1980s and 90s. It had set about establishing itself as the flagship of what would become the Asian century. By the year 2005, of the 13 world cities with populations of over 10 million, 7 would be around the Pacific Rim. By then, China's predicted economic growth of 8% per annum would allow its technicians to continue creating a multimedia supercorridor to rival Malaysia's Cyber City. China's reserve of foreign currency would, by the year 2010, exceed that of Japan. 1 of every 10 corporations around the Pacific Rim would have Chinese investors, many the largest single stockholders. Singapore would be a Chinese city. The 1/3 Chinese population of Malaysia would have tightened its control over trade and investment. In the year 2001, that already accounted for 50%. At the start of the century, the small Chinese populations of Thailand and the Philippines controlled 60% of those nations' economies. By the year 2015, that figure would have increased by a further 20%. Much of China's success came from its export of technology, including surveillance systems. Even nations in Africa and Asia, still impoverished at the start of the new millennium, would, 30 years later, possess its gadgets and built-in robotic brains to understand the likes and dislikes of those they served. These machines, with their artificial intelligence skills, would be the modern-day equivalent of the trusted human servants of the early 20th century. But unlike those butlers and parlor maids who only gossip to each other about their employers, by 2020 the robots who came in so many different forms, shapes, and sizes would be capable of analyzing and assessing and reporting on everything which happened in their environment. They combine their roles of Jeeves and master spies with effortless ease. In China itself, unnoticed and usually unchallenged, surveillance continued to make new inroads into privacy, establish beachheads in Chinese homes and workplaces, and change forever life as people once knew it. Such monitoring has become routine. Chinese visitors were among those at a conference hosted by Codex Data in New York in December 1999. Their hosts had promised they would, quote, learn how to trace email, crack passwords, monitor computers remotely, track online activity, find and recover hidden and deleted data, create trackable files, and locate stolen computers, unquote. They were told that surveillance is increasingly an important intelligence gathering tool. Quote, it is no more than an extension of opening mail, electronic eavesdropping, and planting bugs. The difference is that was once the province of the security services. The difference is that was once the provinces of the security services. Now all sorts of companies and corporations are doing it. We are moving into a world of those who are under surveillance and those who do the surveillance, unquote. The knowing and the known, right? I guess that would be one way of putting it. Okay, we're at the top of page 472 of Seeds of Fire, China and the Story Behind the Attack on America by Gordon Thomas. Or we'll do a few more pages here till it describes the Los Alamos operation. And then maybe what we'll do, Greg, is end this segment for today, and then do another segment of the book Israel and China from Silk Road to Innovation Highway by Lionel Friedfeld and Philippe Metudi, understanding Asia's relationship with the Jewish state.
That sounds good. And what you're just going through here with the rise of what was known as the Asian century and all that entailed. And I think I don't want to get too in depth into this here because I think we talked about this in our we got into this in a previous show we did where we covered the Alfred McCoy's article about how waking up to a post-Trump world where America's lost its global influence basically. And it's very interesting hearing about the combination of the rise of this massive surveillance state, all hand in glove with the rise of the Asian century, and a lot of transferring things of global power in this regard. And then when you going back to this extended nest of what we've called this push for a multipolar world, you have this Asian century. Then you have what took place with in the Obama administration, this pivot to Asia, where it almost seemed like the West was going to reassert its influence, so to speak, with regards to this global trend. And then, Trump comes in with the combination of the over the top hostility towards China and then ultimately what we covered previously out of that was as a result of this, not only is China able to reassert its edge, but also getting these inroads into these Western countries as well, and actually increasing. It seems that there's been an increase in this as a result of the dynamics we talked about previously, but going into this whole topic of the Asian century and the rise of Asia in terms of I think it's a very deep topic, and it's certainly we've revisited it in the past, and it's something to continue to understand. I think it's pretty significant. It's pretty telling in terms of this push for multipolarity, as we've talked about. Okay.
So top of page 472 of Seeds of Fire, China and the Story Behind the Attack on America by Gordon Thomas. And he just pointed out that there are those who are under surveillance and then those who do the surveillance. Quote, technologies mostly developed or introduced in the past 25 years have made possible to already extend surveillance so that hundreds of millions of Chinese who have never been subject to it before are now closely monitored. The results of such surveillance can reshape, reform, or at least control the thinking and behavior of any individual. In China, such surveillance is liberated from any legal or moral obligations or restraints. Consequently, surveillance has become part of a burgeoning industry that spreads itself from welfare institutions to university campuses, reaching through hospitals to all levels of industry and, of course, government. Surveillance is interlocking and in one form or another touches everybody. In China, surveillance is an integral part of pacification, intimidation, obfuscation, propaganda, and control. In its most pernicious form, surveillance is used for behavior modification, including adverse conditioning. Surveillance is always promoted as being done with the best intentions, that it is a less stigmatizing and more human form of control than other sanctions. Surveillance is presented as offering a means to avoid prison, school suspension, eviction from public housing, or an appearance before a court.
It's It's amazing this was being written about. This is close to 2 decades ago when this book was written. And just this is being written about like this close to 2 decades ago. Just imagine the depth to how this is playing out now, much less 2.
Wait, what did you just say? I missed it. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just pointing out that this book was written close to 2 decades ago, and you're already having all of this being detailed and laid out. Just imagine, like, if this was the situation close to 2 decades ago, just imagine what it's like now, much less then. So.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so we're at the middle of page 472 of Seeds of Fire by Gordon Thomas. Okay, I think it's right here. Quote, surveillance is presented as offering a means to avoid prison, school suspension, eviction from public housing, or an appearance before a court. Surveillance is promoted with the unspoken reminder that if you do no wrong while being watched, you will not be punished. In China, no one ever speaks about the gross intrusions into privacy that any surveillance brings. Becoming technologically as advanced as any industrialized country on earth, China still had, in 2001, a per capita national income less than that of many countries generally accounted as poor. Child-loving to a fault, the regime still made it a crime for a couple to have more than one child. China's ancient political theorists had rivaled those of the Greeks, yet their modern political theory remained crude and derivative. But most important of all, China's technology was at the cutting edge. Nowhere was this more important than how the Chinese had exploited the original enhanced promise software that Robert Maxwell had originally sold to Beijing. Just as all those years ago, Rafi Eitan had arranged to have deconstructed the version of the software which had come into his hands after he had posed as, quote, Dr. Orr, unquote, so the Chinese had taken apart, then rebuilt the version Maxwell had sold them. Over the years, many improved versions had been constructed until, by the year 2000, China was ready to use it for its greatest ever coup against the United States. It would become known as the most significant software theft in history. The theft was prepared in an annex at the rear of the Ministry of Defense headquarters in Beijing's Dongchang district. Again, I apologize for messing up Chinese pronunciation. I got to work on my German and my Chinese pronunciation. Okay, we're at the bottom of page 472, Seeds of Fire by Gordon Thomas. Quote, the annex houses the Science and Technology Department. In 1998, when the plan to electronically rob Los Alamos was first mooted, it was under the control of Wang Tongji. He had a staff of less than 100 persons. Many were experts in the difficult art of undetected computer hacking. Some of them had learned their skills while working for various companies in California's Silicon Valley. One by one, they had been recalled to Beijing to take up their specialist work inside the annex. Undoubtedly, it would have taken even longer but for the help Mossad technicians provided. They were part of a still secret relationship, one totally unsuspected by the CIA or its fellow members of the Washington intelligence community, that had developed between Mossad and China's Secret Intelligence Service, CSIS. This relationship between the two countries had started in the aftermath of the Persian Gulf War. China had provided Israel with valuable information about the various types of Iraqi weapon systems that had survived the Allied attacks on Iraq, and which could still be a threat to Israel. Israel's own relationship with the American-led coalition during the war had been an abrasive one, not least because Iraqi Scud missiles had hit Tel Aviv, and Israel had been, in the later words of the then Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, quote, bloody coerced by that bastard Bush, President George Herbert Bush, into not retaliating, unquote. Shamir had welcomed China's initial overtures. As simply as that, the relationship between the two nations had begun. Over the ensuing years, that cooperation had developed on all levels. China had provided Israel with experts on water desalination and agricultural techniques. Israel had provided the Chinese with details of various weapon systems provided by the United States.
This is interesting because you're getting the impression here that at least the more Likud leaning, right wing leaning government of Shamir, who was prime minister at the time of the Persian Gulf War, you're seeing like where Israel senses that already in the early 90s senses that like or at least this aspect of like the Israeli establishment government ruling power at the time was always sensing that the Americans weren't being good enough to them, so therefore you're branching out to the Chinese. It's like what's going on here.
And I then think back to the beginning when it was talked about Mogilevich's apparent relationship with Saddam Hussein. So it's interesting, sort of the Russian, the Chinese, Israel, sort of in the middle, in relationship to that first Gulf War. Very, very interesting dynamics, actually.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's like a combination of like, getting really close to Israel in terms of, sharing information, et cetera, while also like propping up what would become the enemies later on. Or, I mean, what was already the enemy, but then obviously we saw what happened to Saddam Hussein. You've got this entity, basically, as we talked about earlier with Mark Rich and then with Mogilevich. You see a trend going on there.
Yep. Okay. We're on page 473 of Seeds of Fire by Gordon Thomas. Quote, all right. Quote, but it was in the secret world of intelligence, the one inhabited by Mossad and CSIS, that the closest ties had been developed. Those had culminated in 1999 when Ephraim Halevi, then Director General of Mossad, had made a secret visit to CSIS headquarters in Beijing. Shortly afterwards, senior members of CSIS had visited Mossad in Tel Aviv. This relationship between the two services would prove to be crucial in what was to follow. And by the way, one aside here is that this is a longer term relationship. Obviously, it was just that it was being apparently escalated. I think go look at the background of Shaul Eisenberg as orchestrating really early, not that early, but 70s relationship between highest levels of Israeli military and intelligence and the Chinese, but doing it very discreetly, secret landings in terms of planes and all of that. But this is when it really seems like this is when they get really to get together on this.
Yeah, and there's a whole history there that needs to be untangled and figured out between like the U.S. opening up of China that was initiated under, of course, Nixon, of course, under Henry Kissinger, one of the most faithful figures in modern history, and then this whole Israel-China. I mean, there's a lot that needs to be unpeeled and unlayered and understood regarding that, and I think that there's it's a little more going on there probably than meets the eye from a bigger historical perspective on that. Another topic for another time, but all that is extremely fascinating to try to unravel and make sense of.
And that is going to be one of our main instructive mission for Antedote Deepcore text series is to both flush out what is not really being seen while also fleshing out then an understanding. So something in relationship to flushing out the facts while fleshing out the logic, the geopolitical logic. All right, back to the text. Page 473, Seeds of Fire, China and the Story Behind the Attack on America by Gordon Thomas. The bottom of page 473 here. Quote, the entire break-in to Los Alamos was coordinated by Wu Xintang, whose official title was a director of ILD, China's Internal Liaison Department. He was one of China's best spy masters. The date for the unprecedented robbery was set for May 5th, 2000. The target was the high-security vaults in what was itself Los Alamos' most secret facility. It was known only as X Division. Around 3,000 people worked inside a network of cramped offices on the third floor of the main laboratory building, guarded by coded swipe cards whose entry numbers changed every day. The most sensitive of X Division's data was stored in a vault. The strong room had every device known to U.S. security experts. Inside the vault was a fireproof bag that could only be opened by using a special password. Throughout the entire Los Alamos complex, only 24 people had access to the locked bag. Inside the bag were the computer hard drives. Each disk contained detailed technical information, including how to dismantle the bomb designs by terrorists or rogue states. The computer drives were each the size of a pack of playing cards. Every week, members of NEST, N-E-S-T, America's Nuclear Emergency Response Team, based at Nellis Air Force Base outside Las Vegas, checked that the bag had not been tampered with. Access to the hard drives would enable a country like China or a terrorist group to use the information to conceal suitcase-type nuclear bombs and make them more difficult to disarm. The contents of the hard drives would also give anyone who obtained them a massive advantage knowing the nuclear secrets that the United States possess. Okay, there's another page or so, but I just want to point out at this point that the NEST, N-E-S-T, the Nuclear Emergency Response Team, in later texts, that there's actually a whole book about that by Jeffrey Richelieu, I think his name is. I'm gonna go grab it. 1 second, over it, Greg.
Yeah, and I think everything is being laid out here as we continue to delve into and try to figure out this, what we call this multipolar push. I think from this perspective, if this is one of the things that we're still theorizing and hypothesizing among ourselves here. We can't prove this, but we sense that this is making a case as a sense that this might be what's going on, is this long term, with, I think, these ensconced, particularly like this type of very hawkish, neoconservative nest here in the U.S. of the hawks who very much, propped up the Soviet threat during the last years of the Cold War, combined with the propping up of, the Cold War with China that's been going on. It's really been propped up under Trump with a lot of the same people from the Cold Warrior days, at the last days of the Cold War and the last days of the Soviet Union. It would make sense, like this whole this aspects of like this nuclear cooperation, and even aspects of things, if like there is this push away from American global power from the West to the East in terms of, say, China, Russia, with Israel at the center. This nuclear, the aspects going on here with the nuclear dynamic would make sense from that regard, to continue to like covertly strengthen up and prop up these perceived enemy of the West and of America, as far as and almost like clandestinely in the process of like propping up this threat. It almost seems like you're just having going on here would be this a continued further enabling of this to continue to shore up all of these this arsenal, etc. I mean, this is if we're correct. I mean, that's a big if. This is something we're hypothesizing and theorizing among ourselves. But in terms of like a multipolarity, shifting almost like a global power, this would make sense for this to be going on clandestinely under the guise of this the constant threat of China that results in all of this economic action, etc. So just thinking about that out loud.
Yes, and I guess I would assert that it's de facto, and we've talked about this a lot over the years on the Antedote, that the Cold War ultimately served, what is obvious, to build up the weapons and security apparatus and surveillance apparatus ultimately of the countries involved, most obviously the United States and the Soviet Union. And so that is just part of it. That is that sort of strategy of tension outcome of where both sides build up the nukes, they build up the surveillance architecture, they build up the quote unquote third world wars, low intensity conflict, all of the intelligence back and forth, all that then gets recapitulated and transformed in some way in the post-Cold War, and especially in the run-up to and beyond September 11th in the 21st century, and then the initiation of the cyber age, basically, and cyber war. And so that's what we need to be looking at too, is whether this is the de facto outcome of the potential current tension, potentially strategy of tension in relationship to the great power dynamics, most obvious now between the United States and China around technology and cyber and economics, whether we have to think about whether that ends up leading towards AI-driven autocratic, surveillance societies, that all around, and so that is why these kinds of facts and analyses are so crucial right now, to be able to basically place on the table what it is we're actually facing and where we are going if we do not unpack all of this and reconsider what kind of human future we want in our own countries, but also, in around the world. And so that's why I think we need to consider what you said, even if it's quote unquote just a hypothesis. The evidence is already on the table about where these kinds of things head, and it doesn't benefit we the people, no matter where we the people are. And I got the book that I was thinking of, Diffusing Armageddon, Inside NEST, America's Secret Nuclear Bomb Squad by Jeffrey T. Richelson, which is the only place I can find published other than a government document referring to what's a war game going on during September 11th called Operation Jackal Cave. This is the only book, the only sort of, public print that I can see that refers to Operation Jackal Cave, which even people who are serious 9/11 researchers, very few of them have even heard of Jackal Cave. They know all about the, Global Guardian. They know all about Tripod 2 or Tripod 3, whatever it was. They know all about the National Reconnaissance Plane into the Building drill. They know about all the live fly hijacker drills and all of that. But meanwhile, the secret nuclear bomb squad was out of the country on September 11th in Europe for the first time in 3 years. Okay. So these are data points that I put on the table. And this is, then that's what just stuck in my mind when we're reading through what was the target of this apparent, Chinese-Israeli conjunction operation against Los Alamos, was the drives that are belong to NEST. And he says it directly. He said, quote, that I'll just read back through this and we'll finish up here, Greg. But from the bottom of page 473 of Seeds of Fire, China and the Story Behind the Attack on America by Gordon Thomas. Remember, this is 2000. This is the spring of May. This is May of 2000, I believe. Quote, inside the bag were the computer hard drives. Each disk contained detailed technical information, including how to dismantle the bomb designs by terrorist or rogue states. The computer drives were each the size of a pack of playing cards. Every week, members of NEST, America's Nuclear Emergency Response Team, based at Nellis Air Force Base outside Las Vegas, checked that the bag had not been tampered with. Access to the hard drives would enable a country like China or a terrorist group to use the information to conceal suitcase-type nuclear bombs and make them more difficult to disarm. The contents of the hard drives would also give anyone who obtained them a massive advantage in knowing the nuclear secrets that the United States possess. And before moving on, that is one of the things that we were tracking in these two shows, actually, that we referenced before, about nuclear Epstein, Cantor Fitzgerald, Deronin, MMA Special Forces, and the other Maxwell daughters. And then the other one was it
was the nuclear Epstein with Teterboro and the program that elaborated on the Scott Borgeson and Ghislaine Maxwell, and then we got into DCI Tenet's concerns, which we were discussing earlier with regard to Seeds of Fire.
Right. Thank you very much. And one of the things we were discussing is, and this is what's popping out to me right now, is Robert Maxwell was a key player in the lead up, in the preparing the cyber ground for this operation in relationship to Promise. And we won't get deep into this now, but his guy who facilitated that was Senator John Tower. Okay. The epicenter of the Republican establishment over the long term from Texas. Key, Tower Commission. You know, I mean, like, and this was the guy that was Maxwell's buddy who helped get him in and his backdoor Promise software into all of these locations. And thinking back to what I hypothesized in the beginning, that the Epstein-Maxwell operation was this all above, you know, apparently cyber operation, you know, related to cyber technology and cyber operations in the United States. Then you begin to see, oh, yeah, so this network was probably still involved in these kinds of things. And we were talking about what is being trucked and what was being trucked and bartered via the Epstein private planes and relationship to Teterboro Airport. And so that is, to me, I more and more see that, oh, this is an operation. This operation didn't stop. We've already delved into the relationship of, you know, Epstein and his, patron, Les Wexner, hiring Frank Luntz and doing the Iraq study group, basically, and learning how to best pitch the Iraq war as in American interests and not in Israeli security interests. And there's more. And then there's the Johnny Vedmore article about what was going on about Nicole Junkerman on Epstein's plane in the English Highlands outside of GCHQ, the UK NSA, in the fall of 2002, and then the run-up to the Iraq War in 2003, and thinking back to the show that we did about Catherine Gunn, the GCHQ whistleblower, in the run-up to the Iraq War 2003. So more and more I see that this network, that looks like it's operating at some level under some kind of handling by Israeli Al, is in place basically over decades. And some of these operations seem to come to conclusion over, you know, maybe 10 to 20 years after the initial ground potentially was begun to be laid, maybe even longer. So I'm just beginning to notice all of this, and it seems sort of crazy and absurd at some level. Be like, oh, Jeffrey Epstein, that was just some kind of sicko, you know, some weird sicko guy with the girls and stuff like that. You're saying that Jeffrey Epstein was involved in everything from potentially the run up to the Iraq War to maybe even the run up to September 11th. That's what it began. These data points begin to suggest to me. I don't know, but that's what it looks like.
And it makes it's a much darker. It's so much more deeper, and it's so much more darker than just as horrible as like crimes against underage children. Obviously, as horrible as that is in and of itself, when you consider all of the consequences this has on global, on such a wide scale range of issues and matters, the continued cover up over the 2+ decades of the depths and extents of this operation, it becomes, you know, throughout our media apparatus for the most part, political government institutions, the cover up and the continued silence on this, it's much darker, much deeper than just as horrible as even, like, you know, pedophilia and sex crimes are against teenagers, because there are way more. The consequences are so much deeper than just that, as horrible as that is in and of itself.
All right. Okay, here we go. Back to 474 page of Seeds of Fire, China and the Story Behind the Attack on America by Gordon Thomas. Quote, the contents of the hard drives would also give anyone who obtained them a massive advantage, knowing the nuclear secrets that the United States possessed. Firstly, Chinese and Israeli technicians who had flown to Beijing to work in the annex devised a hacking system that would electronically penetrate all the X-Division defenses at Los Alamos. They were helped by the updated version of the enhanced Promise software Maxwell had originally sold to China. A replica of the Los Alamos vault was specially built in the basement of the Science and Technology Department in Beijing. Inside the vault's steel walls was placed a fireproof bag. Inside the bag were put hard drives containing non-secret information. The task of the hackers was to remove that information without revealing signs they had done so. They were to do so not from somewhere in Beijing, but at a considerable distance from the Chinese capital. The hackers were dispatched to Shanghai, several hundred miles away. They set to work. The vault was later opened. There was no evidence the fireproof bag had been penetrated. The team of hackers returned to the annex. With them, they brought true copies of the information electronically lifted from the hard drive stored in the bag. The Chinese planners had worked on the premise that from time to time, the hard drives in Los Alamos would be removed from their fireproof bag and placed in a computer they were certain would be inside the American vault. This would either be done to check for a piece of information or to make sure the disks were in perfect working order. In Shanghai, the hackers had waited several days for the disks in the replica vault to be removed and inserted in a computer inside the Beijing vault. Their success was proof that distance was not going to be a problem. The next test took place in the Luzon Strait between Taiwan and the Philippine Islands. This time the hacking team was on board a Chinese nuclear-powered submarine of the Blue Water Fleet of the People's Liberation Army Navy. The submarine rose close to the surface. Once more the hackers went about their business. Once more they succeeded in electronically penetrating the vault in the Beijing annex. They returned to report their success to Wu Jingtang. Everything was ready. A month later, in late April 2000, the team of hackers arrived in Puerto Penasco at the upper reaches of Mexico's Golfo de California. They were equipped with fishing equipment and boxes of tackle. Their journey to the port had been a long one. From Hong Kong, now part of China, they had flown into Mexico City. From there, they had driven to Puerto Penasco. Waiting for them was their rented fishing boat. Hidden on board, placed there by a CSIS agent in Mexico, was their equipment for hacking. They set to sea, ostensibly on a fishing trip. Using the coordinates they had been provided with, the hackers had homed in on the vault and X Division at Los Alamos. Just as they had waited in Shanghai for the right moment, so they had electronically lifted all the data from the hard drive disks in the fireproof bag when they had been briefly removed for some purpose. A week later, they were back in Beijing. Wait a minute. 1 second here. Is it that? So this happened in May. I believe wasn't there a fire? I think there was a fire in the area of Los Alamos at that exact time. I'm pretty sure there was the Punto Gordo, something like that fire. We'll look into that later, but I'm pretty sure that makes, that would make some sense if you were creating a distraction of some sort to run an operation. All right, we'll look.
You're right. You're correct, Jeremy. There was the Cerro Grande fire, which lasted from May 4th to July 20th, 2000. It was a disastrous forest fire in New Mexico that occurred in May 2000. Fire started as a controlled burn and became uncontrolled owing to high winds and drought conditions. So you're absolutely correct that there was a fire. Over 400 families in the town of Los Alamos lost their homes in the resulting 43,000-acre fire. Structures at Los Alamos National Laboratory were also destroyed or damaged, although without loss or destruction of any of the special nuclear material housed there. So you're absolutely right that there was a major forest fire that occurred in the vicinity right at this time.
Well, that's a very interesting data point. Thank you for looking that up, Greg. And remember, these are fire bags with the nuclear bomb squad disk drives in the fire bags, right? So I would imagine that if you were creating a brouhaha where the bags could be, lifted in some way or accessed where it wouldn't seem super suspicious, under cover of fire would probably be the best. So that doesn't say that this is who did it, of course, but it does suggests that that this is when it happened, I would say. And so that's just a data point. All right. We have almost finished with the section that I was hoping we'd finish. And then we will continue on in a future Antedote Deepcore text on Israel and China, and touch much more on specifically on Microsoft Israel during that. Okay, but back to the text, page 475, Seeds of Fire, China and the Story Behind the Attack on America, Gordon Thomas. Okay, so it says, quote, a week later they were back in Beijing. Late in November 2000, a meeting was held at Los Alamos to discuss not only the electronic theft of the contents of the hard drives, but also the new relationship between Mossad and CSIS that the CIA had finally discovered. Gathered in a conference room in X Division was George Tenet, Director General of the CIA, Britain's MI6 Chief, Dearlove, Director Free of the FBI, and Los Alamos Security Chief Eugene Habinger. There was a consensus the theft had changed, almost certainly for the foreseeable future, the close intelligence links between Washington and London with Israel. Those present could not be absolutely certain how the theft had been carried out. A check on the vault computer gave no clue. The only hint that a break-in had occurred was that the hard drives had not been replaced in the precise way the NES team had last left them. After each visit, the team rearranged the disks in a certain order only they knew. When they had next inspected the fireproof bag, they had found the disks were not in that order. An internal security inquiry had begun at Los Alamos. It established that a member of X Division, Dr. Lee, had inadvertently, so he said, replaced the disks in a different order. This had led to his immediate suspension and eventually being charged with espionage. Meanwhile, the inquiry had continued. This had lasted some weeks. Then the FBI had been brought in. Finally, the CIA had entered the scene. There were many in the FBI and CIA who felt such a casual approach to security was typical of Los Alamos. The implications would conclude Tenet's briefing to the Bush transition team. It would not be many months before signs would emerge as to how they had responded to all he would have said. But for two fine, unassuming Americans, William and Nancy Burke Hamilton, whose pioneer work in creating the world of modern-day surveillance and who had been so cruelly betrayed in return, the third millennium would merely mark the arrival of a new era in which they would fight on for justice, unquote. And that, of course, is referring to the Hamiltons created promise. So interesting loopbacks here, and so there's so much more in this book, and maybe we will return to pieces of it as relevant in the future. But I'm glad we dealt with some of these core pieces of this incident in the background of it.
For certain, absolutely. And I guess as we start to wrap up here, I'll bring this back, going back once again with long-term aspects of this to the current moment, because, I just talked about just before about the potential for like the actual propping up of an entity such as China under the guise of like this hardcore rhetorical, at the very least, hawkishness towards China. It's interesting, like the narrative surrounding like the depths of the China threat. China, right, as we heard repeatedly from the last president, is very much led the way by this particular, which we talked about before, this particular nest of neocons within the going back to the Cold Warrior days of for example, like one of the primary people pushing the constant threat of China is a direct protege of Richard Pearl and the Henry Scoop Jackson network, the original neoconservatives, that being Frank Gaffney, along with a number of people within this Committee on the Present Danger China group, and very, very close proximity to what was known as aspects of the vast right-wing conspiracy, going back to going back long term to the 90s as well as now. And what's never really laid out with regards to this, never mentioned with this, as much of a threat as China is, as much of like a Chinese agent as Bill Clinton supposedly was and as Joe Biden supposedly is now, what's never discussed is this Israeli factor with relation to China, this China-Israel relationship, especially this event. I mean, this could very well be one of the most, such a crucial event in our modern history. This, this story, which sounds wild, but it's also of like this event of May 5th, 2000. I mean, if that actually took place and this is going on, and I mean, then like the depth of this China-Israel thing is just completely never talked about. It's never talked about either at all by like the typical American, at least publicly in a serious manner, by like the actual like American aspects of the foreign policy establishment, intelligence community, etc. But what's never mentioned is this China-Israel factor, and so it's very interesting. Is we've going back to this whole thing, we've identified the Gaffney network, Steve Bannon, the head of Breitbart, made in America, conceived in Israel, leading the way in this narrative and framing of the threat of China. And we also, of course, identified last year Danny Shoham, the Israeli military, Danny Shoham, in the page of the Washington Times in an article written by Bill Gertz, who was one of the preeminent reporters on the China threat going back to the late 90s, originating the stories of like the COVID originating as a bioweapon out of the Wuhan lab largely came out of there, and then the rest of like conservative media, Tucker Carlson, people like Tom Cotton run with this as gospel truth, and it's been going on ever since. There's very much, increasingly you see the concoction of this hardline rhetorical rehashing and perpetuation of the threat of China, national security threat to the U.S., while also the key factor of like the Gaffneys and the Bannons and so many of these people within this nest of like hardline war on terror hawks, hardline pro-Israel hawks, is the omission of the critical central factor in all of this of Israel, and taking advantage of basically the U.S. relationship with Israel to ultimately prop up this and really benefit the interest of the country that they've taken such a hard line against. I want to continue hammering this home because I feel like this is of increasing importance to understand this, because much like with you'll never get like the full picture perspective of Russiagate without looking at like the centrality of Israel in relation to that. It's the same way increasingly with China, is that like to understand both the real aspects of like an actual real national security threat posed combined with the setting up of the enemy and the perpetuation of this rhetorical hawkishness towards China. Meanwhile, this the Israeli factor is right there front and center, central to all of this, and it just it's more and more obvious, I think, as we continue to dig into this information. But it's just it's ignored largely both by the Israel, or at least the Likud Likud hardline hawks, as far as Zionist hawks within the U.S. Elements of the U.S. community, combined with the actual elements within the American foreign policy establishment, et cetera, that actually I don't think actually want this to take place, but still very much largely publicly stay silent about this whole dynamic. So this is central to this, and it's not talked about anywhere. And the people concocting the threat are just about completely concealing the fact that like the country that they are constantly professing to represent as being invaluable to the U.S. and linked, joined at the hip, and can't be separated as far as like the U.S. commitment to Israel. They're not saying a single word about this China-Israel relationship. It becomes, I think, more obvious as time goes on. It really needs to be honed in on and understood.
I want to reference two other potential future Antedote Deepcore political texts that relate to this, and also very much relate to what you're talking about understanding the Trump operation more thoroughly, more comprehensively. And one will be the infamous quote-unquote Steele dossier, the Trump-Russia dossier, which, as we pointed out over the Trump years, over and over again, it specifically said that the Trump people courted the question and the aura of the Russian connection to the Trump campaign, because there was even deeper commitments in other countries. And one of the suggestions is that some of those connections were to China. And so the other source that we might bring into that when we get to it would be Seth Abramson's most recent book, Proof of Corruption, Bribery, Impeachment, and Pandemic in the Age of Trump. And there's two chapters that will be crucial, I think. One is chapter 30, Trump China. And I'll just read a couple paragraphs just so we get a hint of what all, we're talking about and what you're referring to also, Greg, in terms of this bigger aspect that was not dealt with. Quote, Trump's fortune, this is the beginning of chapter 30 on page 295 of Proof of Corruption by Seth Abramson. Trump's fortunes as a businessman trying to do business in China changed dramatically as soon as he launches his presidential campaign in June 2015. This development is not entirely unexpected. Indeed, as recounted in the Mueller report, during the 2016 presidential campaign, Trump would tell his attorney and fixer Michael Cohen that he viewed his candidacy as a, quote, infomercial for the Trump Organization and Trump-branded properties. Before businessman Trump became candidate Trump, opportunities to bring the Trump brand to China had been virtually non-existent. And then skipping down, in 2012, Trump received a $950 million loan from 4 lenders, including the state-owned Bank of China, to, quote, hold 30% ownership of an office building in Manhattan at 1290 Avenue of the Americas, unquote. The highly lucrative ICBC lease, which for years gave a Chinese government-owned entity unprecedented access to a building Trump himself was living in, came up for renegotiation in October 2019. The very month Trump would ask the Chinese Communist Party to assist him in investigating the Biden's activities in China. According to Forbes, Trump earns at least $2 million a year from the ICBC lease. Okay, so there's that, which is, for all the talk of the Hunter Biden laptop and Biden China, I didn't even know that Trump was living in the building that, and the Chinese, had helped State Bank had helped fund, had helped fund the ownership and had access to it, basically. You never hear that. So you begin to understand the way that the focus, the way that the Trump-Russia investigation was focused on, especially by the media, really gave deep benefit to how deep the compromise potentially of Trump by China was. And that's one piece. And then the other piece, and I haven't read through much of this book. I'll have to do some more reading before we get to it, is the final chapter, chapter 42, about COVID-19, page 456. I'm not going to go into any of it there, but it escalates this relationship and a lot of the so-called sort of hard bargaining by Trump in terms of the China, trade deals and all of that, some of which we touched on a little bit in terms of our last show in relationship to the McCoy article, that there was actually a highly entwined relationship there between Trump and the Chinese, and that it was not Trump playing hardball. The whole thing basically ended up coming unraveled from the American context, especially then when you factor in COVID-19 and the impact on the United States and the way that all went down. But we'll have to leave that for a future inquiry. But people who are interested in that angle, I believe that Seth Abramson actually recorded a podcast in the run-up to the election that dealt with that aspect, China and COVID and Trump, in a fairly delving fashion. So people can go look for that.
I'll look for that, and I'll add that when we post it onto our YouTube channel. I'll add the link to that. I'll find it and add the link to that because I did listen to it at the time. So.
All right, thank you. All right, well, this was productive, Greg, and thank you so much for doing this together with me, our first Antedote Deepcore text session where we focused all on Seeds of Fire, ultimately.
Yeah, same. Feeling is mutual, and this is the first of, I believe, many to come. So I think as time goes on, we'll become more refined at this as well. So, but definitely, this has definitely been worthwhile, and so hopefully everybody who's listening is able to get something out of this. And just remember, we're learning along with everyone else as we go through these things. And sometimes you can hear us thinking, out loud as we're processing and going through this. So it's something, and we'll be more refined at this as time goes on. I'm glad to get our feet wet and to get this started, because this is definitely going to be a focus of ours going forward. As I said before, the first of many of these. So yeah, we'll continue digging into the texts. And anyway, thanks, Jeremy.
All right, thank you, Greg. Appreciate it. Seeds of Fire, China and the Story Behind the Attack on America by Gordon Thomas. Antidote, we out.